Don't we have to call roll?
Oh, do we have to call roll? I'm looking. This is why we were going to have Joe do this.
Hey, Carol, sorry, I just hopped in.
I was just going down the welcome and roll call. I thought, all right. Yes, thank you for that. So hard to get good help these days.
By gosh, I dragged myself out of my workshop. I thought it was 6:30 meeting at 6 o'clock. You're lucky you can't smell me, but if I made it for roll call, you better call roll call.
All right.
Member Bartlesmeyer, Member Boykin, Member Sturman.
Here.
Member Berger.
Here.
Member Patton.
Here.
Thank you. Member Brayman.
Here.
Member Donaldson.
Here.
Councilmember Brost.
Here.
Councilmember Edens.
Here.
Councilmember Ottenberg.
Here.
Councilmember Bertolino. Councilmember Rambo.
Here.
Councilmember Hopper. Councilmember Galani. Co-chair Holthouse.
Present. Here.
And co-chair Farmer.
Here.
Thank you.
All right. So I guess as we were about to do there a few moments ago, would anybody care to make a motion to approve the minutes from last meeting? Nobody? All right. All right. We got a first and a second. I guess that's probably a non-debatable thing. So we all approve. Everybody that approves, please say yes.
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 Aye.
Any opposed?
Aye.
And any abstentions?
Abstain.
All right, Mr. Councilmember Brost is abstaining. Okay, so we did have Carol and I had a little chat earlier and we exchanged some emails. I know one of our guests here this evening is double booked. So without objection, we're going to move the presentation, the USGS presentation up to the top if everybody is okay with that. And does anybody have any objection to doing that? I assume probably not. Also, Carol and I were talking that it maybe makes sense after that presentation to just move right on to the our next presentation so we can kind of get our presentations out of the way and then move on with kind of our standard business. If that works for everybody without objection, I assume Mr. Vunich, we're okay kind of swapping those things around?
Yes, sir. I think with the approval of the two co-chairs, I think the agenda can be amended if there's no objection.
All righty. So no pressure or anything, but does anybody object to moving some things around on the agenda? No. All right. With that, then, I believe we're going to go right here into our presentation from the good people at the USGS. Take it away.
Thank you, Mr. Farmer, and thank you again for everybody having me here this evening. Unfortunately, I've got a commitment in about a half hour, but I appreciate the time to bump up here. I don't have a presentation per se. I think more of it's probably more of a question and answer session if that's where this is headed.
Yep.
To talk a little bit about the scope that the USGS had put forward, some revisions that were made to that scope, and some responses by our agency to some comments that were put forth by members there. So I think that's probably what I anticipated, but certainly can get into some other topics if you.
Nope. I think a Q&A is kind of a great thing. I mean, I think everybody's had some time here to obviously go over the original presentation. So I hope we're kind of well versed. Does anybody have any particular questions or concerns, or Joe, is there something specific that you were curious about or any of that?
Mr. Chair and members of the task force, I do want to extend my appreciation to Paul. He did a yeoman's work in turning around the comments that were provided to him by the city, and then was able to yesterday to submit the revised proposal. The only thing I want to identify from the department's perspective, and again, I'll let Paul add to this if I misstated, is that in the original proposal, there was a discussion about analysis of land use within the Cox Creek watershed. And the department responded and said that for the most part, dense development, that which is just a unit per acre, is only authorized or anticipated on a couple of lots, both of which are on Strecker Road on the east side of Cox Creek. Most of the area that was intended to be developed with greater density, again, 1 unit per acre, developed in the past 25 years. Now, most of the development, if any, is going to be large lot, single family at a density of 1 unit per 3 acres. So from the department's perspective, it thought that having a component of the study spend a lot of time on land use may not be as best spent as talking about what we're experiencing in terms of weather pattern change and climate change. And so with that, Mr. Widland was kind enough to incorporate the suggestion, but it does add a cost component, and I just wanted to identify that. The study's gone up a little bit, but graciously, I believe USGS has absorbed some of that, and we as the city would absorb the remainder. Now, Dr. Hammer provided some comments, which I believe Mr. Ridland addressed in almost all inclusive, and then Ms. Holthouse as well, our co-chair. So with that, I'll just conclude. That was the major point I wanted to make. It's just that the study's gone up in cost nominally, but it has gone up. Thank you.
Yeah. And I'll add to that a little bit that, we think it's very appropriate to take that approach. We have several different studies that we've looked at that involve climate hydrology and taking a look at 30-year plus projections in terms of precipitation and translating that down to the hydrology aspect. So this is nothing new or uncommon, but getting that feedback was kind of an assumption that we kind of had in the back of our mind, yet we didn't know exactly how far we wanted to go with this in terms of creeping the scope too much to hit some sort of a cost prohibitive threshold. But we certainly think it's much more of a rigorous effort to be able to produce that and have that involved in the study. So we're certainly glad that it was even suggested, I guess.
Great. Does anybody else have any questions or concerns at all about what we've been talking about here with this study?
My question would be, the proposal indicates the work and the, therefore the funding beginning in 2022 if a contract is signed by October 1st. Would there be any opportunity if we got moving at our end that any of that would end up in 2021?
Yeah, that's a great question. What's challenging for us, and October 1st of 21 is the beginning of FY22 in our federal fiscal year. But between this month and October, things are going to be a little challenging for us as we have a lot of obligation that's already out there to staff. It's not impossible. I mentioned one of the discussions prior that our footprint is a three-state center, and so we can potentially pull other folks in within that three-state center, or we can go outside of that, at least to get the ball rolling, so to speak. It's not impossible, but it may be a little bit challenging to do anything prior to that October 1st start date. So if we get closer to a set of dates there where we needed to start something earlier, then we definitely want to entertain those discussions and make sure that we can staff up to do that.
So Joe, correct me if I'm wrong, or I guess maybe I'll just ask it as a question. So we have some money that has been allocated in 2021 for us to kind of get the ball rolling, so to speak, on some version of some of these projects. In the event that doesn't come off the books this year, does that not just roll over then to be available in 2022, or do we need to go back through real authorization and things like that?
Mr. Cross is the expert on this, but I think there's something called an encumbrance. Mr. Cross, would you like to run with that ball for me? Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Vunich. Yes, that is absolutely right. You can encumber the monies that would be allocated for this proposal such that they would be available then in fiscal year 2022.
Okay, because if I think if I remember right, Joe or Steve, don't we have, I think, maybe $100,000 or something, $111,000 I thought I saw somewhere left. Is that right?
Of the initial amount, that's correct, 111,000.
Okay. And then just for clarification's sake, for those perhaps watching online, and we have our new member who was just recently appointed, does anybody foresee an issue with if perhaps a magic money tree grew somewhere and we could get both the study and all of our critical areas under repair with those two things happening relatively concurrently? Does that create an issue for the study or the repair or any of that stuff? Or are we in good shape if we could do that?
Certainly, Councilmember Farmer, I'd like to think that we'd be in great shape, because after 2+ years of work, we actually be engaging in a long-term, what I would consider definitive study of Cox Creek and the problems that created it and the solutions, hopefully, that can solve it. And then we also be working on the 2 priority critical locations, or whatever that number might be.
Yeah.
Mr. Cross and I obviously will have some discussions as we enter into the mid-year budget adjustments and see what projects that the department thought it might be able to complete in 2021 that it isn't, and shift maybe some of that funding over to stormwater, the stormwater management and our erosion control efforts.
Yes, sir. Scott, go ahead.
Mr. Farmer, when you mention a magic money tree, are you referring to some type of a federal grant or something of that sort?
I mean, I think at this point, we would take anything that would come along. I know Mr. Sturman has shaken every tree that exists to try to find all of the pennies. And, you know, we are certainly going to have a conversation, I think, about some federal money. But as you may already know, Scott, or as you will see, this is a big number that we're going to have to come up with. So
Sure,
it's going to take a concerted effort, I think, from multiple paths to get us across the finish line for sure.
okay. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Anybody else have any questions?
I wanted to add one other comment. This probably may be relevant, if I can. I want to emphasize that we can start an agreement earlier than October 1st, excuse me, but we wouldn't be able to execute anything in terms of, putting boots on the ground and doing some work up until that date. There could be a little bit that we could do prior to that, but it would be pretty marginal, not unless we extend outside of our footprint and find some staff to do that. But sometimes, and again, I don't know the fiscal ins and outs of the city, but sometimes if we're opening up an agreement that spans over the course of 2 years plus, and that's a place to put monies to where it can be executed, in that timeline and that's suitable with the city, then certainly, we can always theoretically start the agreement earlier if that provides some benefit. It may or may not be any benefit at all to anybody within the city, but we at least want to make mention of that. So.
And then kind of along those lines with this being sort of basically a 2-year plan, in terms of paying things out, is it kind of a 50-50 year over year? Is it backloaded? Is it front loaded? How does that usually work for you guys?
Yeah, let me essentially let's start with the billing, and I'm not the accounting department necessarily, but I'll do my best here. There's quarterly billing that's somewhat standard, but billing can be however you want it. So I know that that's the way that is. But in terms of our own contributions to it, these are dollars that we really wouldn't be able to execute and use towards the effort in cost share, not until October 1st.
Okay.
So, the only thing I was suggesting prior to that is just a place to open the books a little bit bigger in terms of the timeline or the agreement that goes beyond 2 years. Maybe it starts a little earlier as a place to put money, but we can carry over those dollars. And what I mean by carrying over those dollars, it's the reimbursable portion. It would be the portion that comes from the city. But our appropriations are pretty standard. They're locked in year to year. So we can't execute those dollars until October 1st in the FY22 fiscal year. And then we would get a new bunch there coming in on the FY23 fiscal year to do that.
Okay.
If it helps a little bit.
So I guess maybe Steve or Joe, if now would be maybe the appropriate time for us to perhaps make a motion that, we think that this study would be a good idea, and, it would be perhaps time to get that on the city council's radar, because I'm sure that conversation maybe won't be an immediate one. Is that kind of the direction we need to go, or procedurally, would there be something else that we need to do?
Joe, I'll let you start with it, and then I'll fill in if need be.
Mr. Farmer, the department would respectfully request a motion, second, and vote by the task force to endorse the study as presented. And I actually do have it on work session for this coming Monday night, assuming there would be a positive vote. If not, then I would withdraw it from the agenda. Thank you.
Okay. Lauren, is that you wanting to make that motion?
Yes, make the motion to endorse as presented.
Anything you would like to add? No? All right. Would anybody care to second? Mr. Rambo, seconding?
No, I wasn't. I had a question before we
Oh, sure.
get trained. I just want to make 100% sure that this plan, I don't know if it's a template and y'all don't deviate from your particular template, but if it's possible to highlight what has happened in the upstream in the watershed to bring us to this pass. In other words, the additional construction and stuff. We've all talked about it a lot. You've spoken about it. I think we're all aware of it, but I would like it to be highlighted even so the casual observer can't really miss the idea that it was lots of paving and hardscape and tree removal and those kinds of things that led to some of the erosion problems in addition to the climate change itself. Is that a reasonable request, or is that already something that you guys would typically do?
Yes, Mr. Rambo, I think that some of that is intrinsic in the scope. We certainly have data that's available that we're going to be looking at more in a hindcasting, so to speak, in retrospect, and making some correlations in that regard. And that may satisfy some of your inquiry there. But in terms of, I know what's been mentioned already, a path forward, then, climate change is more the predominant variable that we want to focus on. So there will be some element that will look back historically and provide correlation to some of the effects that we've seen. And certainly we'll stand on the shoulders of Dr. Hammer and some other folks that have done, collected some data there as part of that. But most of the study is really kind of focused on monitoring in its current condition. Of course, there's just with what we've got in there for a couple of years, and then looking into the future, more predictability sense, and evaluation, of course, of storage and a few other things. But we will go back and take a look and draw some correlating effects there. To get that granular, it depends on how granular we want to get.
No. I don't want to send you off on a tangent. I just think that some of these kinds of documents tend to be highly technical, and it takes a scientist to interpret the things that you guys think are quite prominent. And I'm looking for the easy button, the watershed for dummies kind of thing that helps us as we move forward to constrain those sorts of developments, because I have some upstream from me. There's a direct correlation between the development that has occurred and the runoff that I see in a given type of rain event. And I'm blaming climate for the catastrophic flooding, but there's a whole lot of erosion that occurs just because we have hardscapes upstream. And I just want that to be crystal clear. And I'm hoping that we can do that if everyone else agrees.
Yeah, and if I can real quick, that's a great comment, because part of what our agency is tasked with, and its mission is really an educational piece. We talk about taxpayer dollars, or however you wish to say it, that helps fund some of the work. It has to be really kind of put out there in that context. So yes, there can be some real analysis in there that can kind of build that to the average person or whatever that's not used to that, it can kind of be a little heavy. But there will be a lot of that discussion. When we write these scientific investigation reports, we do include, the detail, but we also include, kind of the generic settings of why things are the way they are. And how did we arrive at this point? Some of the things that you're asking about, because we are tasked with a lot of outreach and being able to share this with people and being able to educate them. So you're going to hopefully find that, and you will, into this deliverable.
Okay, thank you. I mean, I'll read it, and some folks are just looking at the index. And so if there's something specific about causes, that's probably adequate. Some other folks might disagree. But anyway, thank you very much.
All right. So Rob, did you want a second, or does somebody else want a second? Scott?
I'd rather let someone else second.
All right. We've got our second. Do we need a roll call vote, guys, or just a voice vote for this?
I think a voice vote would suffice, Mr. Chair.
Okay. So all in favor, everybody understand we're doing all in favor of basically passing this along to the city council for further discussion on approval of the USGS plan. All in favor, say aye.
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 All right. Any opposed? Whoever the last aye was that just a late yes or an early no? I assume we're all in favor. All right. Any abstentions? No. Good. All right. So I guess, Mr. Vunich, we'll keep that on the schedule for Monday, and we'll have that conversation in a little bit of a broader sense.
Thank you, sir, and thanks to Mr. Ridlin again.
Yeah.
Yes. Thank you, Mr. Ridlin. We appreciate your time, and have fun doing whatever else you got going on there tonight.
Will do. Thank you, guys.
All right. Thank you. As we discussed earlier, I guess, Mr. Wilson, will kind of move to you at this point. And I think if nobody's opposed, I'm not 100% sure. I feel like I have a pretty good grasp of the plan, so I don't know that we need to go into super granular detail on everything. But if there's some top level stuff that you want to add, that certainly would be an appropriate time to do it.
Thank you, sir. Let me see if I can share my screen. A couple of, there were some good questions that came up regarding kind of the general approach as far as our stream cross section. And I'd like to drop back and talk about that just briefly. So let me see if I can figure out how to share my screen here. And okay, are you all seeing the triple meander plan view?
Yes, sir.
Yep.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so just briefly revisiting, talked about the triple meander, some revetments on the outside of the bends here, grade control, and then we went to a typical section that I've modified a little bit here, and I apologize if I may have oversimplified it with in the original report and presentation. And what we're looking at here, the dashed brown line here is the existing grade. And this is a section cut through the second meander bend. And this is on a distorted scale. I wanted to talk a little bit about that as to why we do that. The intent's not to mislead or confuse anyone, because this looks very steep, but it's actually a 1.75 to 1, which the angle of repose for riprap, depending on the air or revetment, rock revetment, depending on the angularity, is between 1.1 and 1.5 to 1. So this is flatter than the angle of repose for rock riprap. And we would be looking at a vegetated revetment. The actual details of that would have to be worked out during final design. A lot of it's going to depend on the various water levels, what type of soils we're dealing with at a particular location. On the, well, here we go. Okay. This is another schematic, typical section. This is one prepared by the NRCS with the basic rock toe protection, vegetated embankment. Dr. Hammer prepared a nice graphic, I believe, for the Clayton Road project, cross section here, again showing the original bank line, the riprap and vegetation. And then back to the original scale, if I plotted that cross section from the meander bend there on the second triple meander, the one that was on that first section, this is what it looks like at a 1-to-1. So just to give you an idea of why we plot those at a distorted scale, is so that we can pick up the subtleties in the cross section. So does that address everyone's questions? There seem to be some questions on that particular part of the presentation last time.
I, for one, Mr. Wilson, had a question, and that sure clears that aspect up for me. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Sturman. Yeah, those are good questions. They're certainly fair questions, and I apologize that again that probably oversimplified things for that particular part of the presentation. We talked about the elegant child detention. I'm going to skim on through here, get on down to the evergreen detention. This is the embankment behind the house. You can see the house is right here at the top of the bank. We've had a major slope failure. You can tell from the line here where the slope has failed and moved out into the creek. And that's directly downstream, diagonally straight across from an outlet from a 42-inch MSD storm sewer. And so part of what we're proposing on this one is to construct a retaining wall along the house side of the creek, and that retaining wall would either be a stacked block like a ready rock type wall with a concrete foundation, or an actual concrete retaining wall, depending on how much space we've got to work with, because this is very tight behind those houses. Mr. Wagner, if I leave something out, jump in here and help me out. And then we would be installing an impact type energy dissipator at the outlet to that storm sewer to reduce future erosion in the stream channel at that location. The question, this one comes in at about $310,000. There's a fair amount of work on the retaining wall. It's going to be some pretty tough access getting in. There is the property on the upper part of the screen on the left side of the stream channel is owned by a property owners association, and that would most likely be our path for access. So there would be some easement acquisition required there. Any questions on Evergreen? Yes, Joe.
Mr.
Mr.
Vunich,
Chair,
yeah, go ahead.
with your permission.
Yeah,
So, Mr. Wilson, if we were to obtain easement rights for access to do the project, would you consider that a temporary easement just for construction purposes, or do we need a permanent easement for maintenance purposes as well?
I would expect there would be a combination of both permanent and temporary easement. I would suspect that you're going to want to keep a permanent easement for maintenance purposes. It probably would not need to be near as extensive as the construction easement, but I would expect you would want some of both, sir.
Thank you.
Mr. Berger.
Thank you. I was just curious if you had an estimate of how tall that wall would need to be. And then I assume that would then be essentially load bearing. So, if we needed to go back and fix any of the embankment above that wall that we've lost already, that wall would be capable of supporting that type of load.
That's a great question. And yes, we'd probably be looking at a wall in the neighborhood of 8 foot to 10 foot above the stream bed. And probably what would dictate the height of that wall would be the frequency at which flow reaches that depth, because we don't want that wall overtopping very often. But yes, it would be a structural wall. There would have to be some geotechnical work that goes into the actual design of this to figure out how to stabilize the slope above it, because clearly we're not going to go 30 feet all the way up to level it up. But yes, that's a primary component of this one, is trying to figure out how to stabilize that upper bank up above the wall and make sure that we've got the structural support for it.
Great, thank you.
Ms. Edens.
Yes, so this is going to incorporate a couple of different places at once, but it's the same kind of general question, so bear with me, which is, as I'm talking to my homeowners that are dealing with these proposals that incorporate either entirely private held lands or a public and private mix, is opportunities for either separating costs or on critical areas that we know we can't really wait. So this is certainly a critical area. My first question is, have we approached the HOA and asked them to do an emergency assessment? Has that happened?
I can't answer that. I have not. Mr. Bunich, mind if I bat that ball back your way?
No, Mr. Wilson, I'm glad to try to address it. Ms. Edens, we have not yet contacted the trustees of the Evergreen subdivision. Again, with the preparation of this conceptual design and the cross section and then the cost estimate, we're finally getting to a point where we have some information that we can take back to the residents that staff those homeowners associations and tell them why we need their assistance and the cost component, if it's a share, if it's an outright assessment, whatever the situation might be. But we're getting very close now.
Okay, I was just wondering about that process. I don't know if the rest of the committee knows, and I know we've had some turnover, but myself and Ken and Joe, and I think Dr. Hammer was on the meeting with the Land Learning Foundation when we tried to work out an agreement with Quafen Farms, which is also on the list, and it did not go too well. So maybe if we come back with some engineering specs as well, and then just for me, as we go further down, I know we talked about this at council as well, but I'm trying to manage expectations and get results at the same time in the Highlands, and so I was hoping to have a little bit more specifics on the differences between repairs to private property costs versus the stream, which happens to be public in my area, but not in this particular scenario with Evergreen. So it's a little bit of a different situation, but I think anything that we can do on subcategories is really helpful when I communicate to citizens, okay, this is what you can expect the city to cover, and this is your responsibility as a you problem. This here is a we problem. So I'm going to need a little bit more fine tuning on at least 2 out of the 3. But I really appreciate it, and I'm just very excited to have something concrete. So,
Mr. Chair, if I may, just very briefly.
Absolutely.
Ms. Edens, as we're finding with our strategic planning process, that public benefit component that allows taxpayers' money to be spent, let's say, on privately held property, seems to be broader than the Department of Planning thought for many years. And so let's say in the case of the Wild Highlands at Wild Horse, we have both, as you know, a sanitary manhole that's exposed. We have the breach, but also downstream, we're facing some real threats to Strecker Road, I believe, and I think Dr. Hammer has voiced those on many occasions. So I think there's a potential here between MSD, the homeowners association, and the city, that if we did a project of an appropriate scale, I think we could certainly justify it just on Strecker Road alone, but also on the sanitary sewer. And so from that perspective, John Young has done, I think, a yeoman's job of kind of helping us understand. And so from that perspective, I think there's a more positive here than negative, which is what is where I think we started more so on the negative side. Thank you.
Great. Mr. Rambo or Dr. Rambo.
Yes, this was the discussion that I was hoping to start off. Ms. Eden beat me to the punch, but Joe explained about the Cox Creek Highlands, but we were originally looking at the Evergreen Forest Court. And I think since the beginning, we've always talked about separating public and private, and I still don't have a good handle on the threat to public infrastructure from the Evergreen Forest Court location. There are a handful of houses that, you know, it's a tragedy for each one of those 4 or 5 people, but we need to be able to justify this in terms of, at least partially in terms of public infrastructure. So Joe, I guess, is the right person to ask. Joe, do you have a handle on what public infrastructure is threatened, or is this strictly private and we're going to negotiate with the homeowners association for some cost sharing?
The particular case of Evergreen Forest Court, one of the hopes is that MSD would find some type of either stormwater or sanitary sewer facility that was at risk. They did not. So one of the 3 legs on that stool is not going to participate. Downstream is Forest Leaf Parkway and a bridge structure that is maintained by the city of Wildwood. Part of what I'm hoping Mr. Wilson, Mr. Wagner, and Dr. Hammer can do is analyze, is that slope failure that's causing the problem for the residential properties at the top of the ridge just isolated there, or if we do nothing, is that slope failure going to basically go downstream, which is my impression. And so I think this is going to be maybe part homeowners association and part city. At least that's
okay, sure, but it's a stitch in time, and there may be some concern about downstream public infrastructure, and we need to determine that. And that's all I wanted to get to. So thanks a lot for that clarification.
Great. Any other questions? I don't think I see any hands. Mr. Sturman.
Yeah, I don't know if this is the proper time. If you don't mind me backing up a little bit, or here at this one, triple meander, or what is shown on the screen now. I have a general, I guess, design or engineering question. You're indicating, Mr. Wilson, you've been indicating the angle of repose with a design system on the bank that receives the main impact of the water. Then when it comes to the bed, I'm still not quite sure what you have on the bed. And then I'm assuming on the other bank that does not receive the big impact, there is nothing or a lot less. I've been on the impression, and I've just been, since I've been on this task force learning about this, in the beginning, I was under the impression that the main thing, of course, is to slow down the velocity of the water. And to do that, one would have a kind of a full throat, both banks and the bed, and with the vegetation coming up periodically, enough so as to slow the water down to a point where erosion is mitigated way, way down. I don't know if it's to zero, but at least a lot less. That's my question.
Well, on the stream dynamics on a bend like this, your erosion and scour is occurring at the location of the highest velocity, which is at the outside of the bend. And you tend to get deposition, and that's what you're seeing on the inside of the bend. And that's what you're seeing with all these point bars, where the velocity drops low enough that it just settles out in the on the inside of the bend, all of the sediment that's transported in the stream. So typically for these types of improvements, you reinforce the outside of the bend, knowing that even if we went in and built a prismatic channel around those bends, you just wind up with a bunch of gravel deposited on the inside of the bend in the channel. So it's not very effective to try and plus you don't have near the erosion going on the inside of the bend of the bank. In most places where those point bars are formed, the gravel runs right up level to the top of the bank on the inside of the bend. And so that's why we try and deal with those critical areas where the shear stress due to high velocities is the highest, and that's the outside of the bend.
So do I understand correctly then the treatment, the design system is just on the bank of impact? Is that, did I understand correctly?
In most cases. Now we do are installing grade, or proposing to install grade controls, and that's what these structures are here. That prevents the stream from down cutting and increasing the gradient at that location. So that grade control structure is going to help hold that bed at the elevation that it is now and not allow it to down cut any further, thus arresting some of the erosion that's going on in the stream bed.
Yeah, okay, so just there, not on the bed or the other bank. So then the $2.8 million estimate you had for the triple meander, that was there just to apply the system to the bank of impact only
yes.
Throughout.
There's also, we have a couple of great, let me back up to the triple meander plan view real quick.
Excuse me for going out of turn here.
No, that's fine. That's fine. That's why we're here to try and answer questions. Okay, here we are, the triple meander. The elegant child is here at the lower right-hand corner. We start the project off with a grade control structure, and then the revetment around this high bank. The one thing that's different with this particular one is we are proposing an overflow channel where it's beginning to try and cut off this meander bend. So what we're wanting to do is put in probably a vegetative and fabric erosion control fabric line channel across here, so that when it does get out of bank, which happens fairly frequently, I've been down there 4 different times, and there's signs of it having overtopped at least 2 different times between November of 2020 and April of 2021. So this happens fairly frequently, but if we give it a place to go that we can control, then we can cut down on the erosion and hopefully prevent this being a cutoff that would deposit a tremendous amount of sediment into the stream, change the gradient, and further destabilize the system. So we start with revetment on the outside of this bend, revetment on this bend, comes on around to another grade control structure. This is the Strecker Road improvement that went in, Mr. Vunich, could you help me, 10 or 12 years ago?
Longer than that, about the mid-2000s.
About mid to, okay. And it's vegetated nicely and holding it, and it's a real good example for us for whoever gets in to do the final design on this thing. There's places where that rock is held very well, and there's places where it's moved. So we've got a good yardstick to compare to as far as what size rock needs to be placed in there along that toe to stabilize it. So this is an existing revetted bank. Then we would come on down to the last meander. We've got a grade control on this tributary that's coming in. There's a partial grade control structure there now. MSD's put riprap over one of their sewer lines. It needs some attention. And then a grade control at the downstream end of this last bend. You're hitting a fairly stable reach of stream downstream of this last bend. So place a grade control here so we don't upset the dynamic of the stream there. Does that help? Or
Yes, yes, it sure does. Thank you.
okay, you're certainly welcome. Good questions. Good questions. Okay, we're almost finished, folks. Please bear with me just a couple more minutes, and we'll.
It's great.
Okay.
Keep it up.
Pardon?
I just said it's great. Keep it up.
Okay, thank you. Okay, let's look briefly at Wildwood Meadows. This is along Strecker Road. Just since I've been involved in this thing since October, this bank has moved back at least 15 feet, or November of 2020. It continues to fail. You can see where the grass has sloughed off at the top of the bank, slid down to the toe. And part of what is providing kind of a nick point, if you will, that's initiating part of this bank failure is this rock that's been placed at the outlet of a channel that comes from up here on Strecker Road, comes down and dumps off into over the creek bank here. So it's creating turbulence upstream and downstream and causing some considerable erosion at that point. And here you can see the point bars forming. You're starting to get vegetation on it. It's up almost level with the top of the bank on the inside of the bend. We look at this from a plan view. We were looking at basically this point right here was where that riprap was. So you can see that it's making a hard 90-degree bend. A lot of deposition here, a lot of erosion here, and then a reverse turn to go through the bridge opening. And that channel doesn't line up very well with that bridge opening. So we're looking at one of the proposed improvements would be to do some revetment work at the approach to the bridge to line that up a little bit better and provide better streamlines going through the bridge and arrest some of the erosion that's going on this bank. And that one's estimated at about 960,000. Okay, last but not least, we're down at the community park. Here's the pavilion. This is on Bonham Creek, near the upper end of Bonham Creek. There's a real sharp bend that's almost getting over into the sidewalk here, just upstream of the structure. When we look at it in plan view, these contour lines right here, this is that sharp bend, and it's almost, well, it's in excess of a 90-degree bend here. And what we're looking at here is actually doing a channelization project where we cut off this small meander, stabilize its grade control, and provide conveyance for the water through here. We'd be filling in this area and stabilizing the bank back behind the revetment here. So this one is more of a traditional channelization type project. But again, we'd be using some type of bioengineering vegetated revetment, again, depending on site conditions as far as what type of vegetation would be appropriate there. This is the section right through that cross section slice right through that big bend. And so basically what we'd be doing is moving that channel over to the right with a revetment, take the material that's cut, place it in, build the slope out and stabilize that particular section of the stream. And that one is estimated at about 490,000. Any questions on this so far? Okay, so the
Once
bottom
again,
line,
I think Ms. Donaldson's hand is up there first. Sorry, Rob.
Sure.
My hand's getting tired.
Uh,
I have a question back to the wall. I'm envisioning this, and and it may sound like a ridiculous question. However, I have a son that would have figured out a way to access that wall and get on it. Who's responsible if someone were to get injured? Is Wildwood, is a subdivision? Is it accessible? Will it be?
I would imagine whoever does final design on that's going to put some type of fencing along top of that wall.
Okay,
You have to, with something of that height, it has to have some type of fencing.
that's what I wondered. That's what I was picturing, but I just wanted to clarify. Thank you.
Oh, good question.
Dr. Rambo.
Yes, Mr. Wilson, is that channel width that you're showing there at Community Park, is that like the minimum width we can get away with? That's a heavily overgrown area, and aesthetically it's quite nice, and it isolates the pavilion from the road, which admittedly is not that well traveled, and it just gives some additional privacy over there in the playground area. And I'm wondering if you all looked at the large trees and figured out, what's going to have to be removed, and chose the optimum location for that new channel. Can you speak to that? Maybe Joe Vunich knows.
We have not done a detailed tree assessment at that location. This was looking at it strictly from the most hydraulically effective approach.
Sure.
Whenever
Sure,
you
that's
get
what I
into
figured.
detailed design on it, there's a number of things that would come into play, and preservation of there may be a couple of spectacular trees back there in the brush that I wouldn't want to go away. Absolutely. I understand that completely. And at that time, then it may be necessary to make changes in the alignment. The probably the minimum width on that is going to be dictated by the FEMA floodplain.
Okay.
Anything that's done out here, we don't want to be raising floodplain elevations, putting more people in a position where they have to acquire flood insurance. That's not a good thing by any means.
But we're fixing to pave a 1/4 acre directly upstream from that to make some hard surface courts, and so it's going to exacerbate the problem. But we built a beautiful park in nature, and I'd hate to not consider that as we're doing this sort of planning. So that's all I wanted to ask.
Yeah,
thanks.
Good question.
Mr. Sturman.
Yes, Mr. Wilson, I see you got the banks covered here, and you're going to cut down to the bed down to a certain level at the lower end of the wall of the bank. Are you just going to excavate down to existing materials or situation there? And will that be the extent of it? I mean, the design is to do that, just to excavate down to a certain level and leave exposed what the existing materials are there, soils or rock?
No, you'd have to go in with something to stabilize the flow line of that channel, either with a smaller riprap or some type of reinforcing material in there. So, yeah,
It'll have a design system there to retard the.
Yeah.
Okay.
No, you don't. We wouldn't want to just leave it the bare earth. Absolutely.
Yeah. What's the green line up above on top of the fill? Is that just the top of the fill? Will that be granular, I guess, stone?
Yes, sir. You'd start off with a granular material that's graded, goes from a larger material to a smaller material so that it traps the soil in the natural bank so that it doesn't move freely through the backfill. And then that upper portion, you're gonna come back with a layer of probably a geotextile followed with some topsoil so that you can get some type of vegetation established along that green line.
Okay, thank you.
All right.
Hey, Joe.
Yeah.
I think it's worth noting on this particular design that while we would put in some temporary stabilization on the bottom of that channel, the goal would be that we would set those grade controls at the top and bottom to maintain a slope where the natural sediment will flow in, and it will look like a natural stream eventually once the sediment begins to move through that section. And hopefully then what you have is a with the bioengineered sides, and then the right slope on the bottom with the right geometry, you'll basically just have a natural stream reform, and it'll look similar to what you have out there now.
That fits along with what we're hoping for, I think.
Yeah, that's the goal, certainly, of the design.
Awesome. Okay, does anybody else have any questions or concerns? I don't think I see anybody. Mr. Wilson, what else you got to show us? Anything?
Okay, we've got this initial batch of projects, 6 projects coming in at about 5.3 million for the total cost. For project costs include estimates for engineering, surveying, mapping, easement acquisition. Does not include legal fees if you have to do any condemnation work or that type of thing. This is, I believe, Co-Chair Holdhouse had asked about allowance for inflation. This is in today's dollars, and that's one of the things we were clarifying in the report text, that that we're not trying to project this into the future, because frankly, I have no idea how many years it's going to be before you try and build it. So the odds are you'd have to reproject it to whatever year you're looking at for construction on the various projects anyway. So that was one of the good questions came from last time. Okay. As far as,
Mr. Wilson, could
Yes,
I
sir.
ask, go back to that screen,
Yes, sir.
please? I have one quick question. These numbers, okay, you've got 2,400 of the bank length. Yeah, it was a 1,200 overall lineal feet, but cost per bank foot, is that the total height of the bank per lineal foot, that $1,182?
yes, sir. That's coming from, that's per linear foot of the bank that we're
So that has to be a super average depending upon the height?
absolutely. And again,
What is your average? What do you figure on that? What did you figure the average height then to be, if I may? You have that?
on that one, on the triple meander, we were looking at a total of about 13 feet of height total, which with about 4 feet of it buried. So you're looking at 8 or 9 feet above the stream bed to the top of the revetment.
So that's about, then you're about 118 or $156 per square foot then? Is that per square foot then? If you're 10 foot high, for easy math?
Roughly, yes, sir.
Okay. Okay, thank you again.
Wilson, I have a question. This is David Hammer.
Yes, Dr. Hammer.
Can you go back to the Elegant Child, the triple meander again, please?
Sure, you want the plan view?
Please.
Okay, just a minute here. I'm sure there's a faster way to do this, but there you are, sir.
Thank you. As we look past the second meander, where you've got your second grade control and you've got that yellow rectangle that indicates where you're planning to do some remedial work to eliminate or reduce erosion overflow from overflow there.
Yes, sir.
That bank that's on the south side of the stream there, right where it says grade control 2, has moved considerably in the last 2 or 3 years, and there's some pretty active erosion there now, and I don't see any indication that you plan to do anything to stabilize that. The stream has been meandering back and forth from that. It's actually the third bend. And at the present time, it's right up against where you've got that grade control structure, and there's some pretty active erosion. So have you addressed that at all, or do you plan to?
That grade control structure is, we cited that based on tying into the upper end of the limits of riprap that have been placed along that section of the bank. Is where
Well,
we're looking at.
upstream from that riprap, there's some pretty active erosion right now on that bank, and has been for the last couple of years. So you might want to take another look at that, is all I'm suggesting.
Okay, yeah, absolutely. Good suggestion. Thank you.
So Dr. Hammer, is that area of new erosion, is that upstream from the Strecker Road area that was repaired by the city a number of years ago?
Yes, it is. It begins right here where Joe's got his red dot. Joe, if you can move that to the left as we're looking at the screen. A little farther down. I wish I could, yeah, back where you were. Towards that left corner, the top left corner of that yellow area, that's where that erosion starts. And you may recall, I've given a couple of presentations where I showed how that bank has changed since about 2014. That bank that ends right there, where that grade control is, has been eroding pretty rapidly since then. That's what I'm talking about. So it's actually upstream from where the riprap begins that leads into the Strecker Road cut bank repair.
Thank you.
And there would have to be some type of transition going from that overbank relief channel to tie into the flow line of the channel at that point. So that's certainly a final design question, is how you make all those tie-ins and transitions. And that section of bank definitely warrants attention.
Thank you.
All right. Does anybody have anything else? All right, Mr. Wilson, I think you maybe had one or two more slides.
Just one or two. Yes, sir.
All righty.
Okay, as far as work in progress, we're currently refining our cost estimates. Trying to collect some additional data to make sure that we're where we need to be on those. We're also developing criteria for detention basin analysis to see what could be done, modifying some of these detention basins to improve flood control, water quality, and reduce erosion in the streams. There's a number of characteristics associated with detention basins that I think we've got some real opportunities to make some improvements in the receiving stream. We're looking at the stream network for other possible areas that need to be included on the priority list, other than the previous, it wasn't on the original 18 list. And then we'll be looking to get our final report in for review by the city and Dr. Hammer early July, and have that finalized for you by your July meeting. As far as some of the conclusions here, one thing, I guess everybody that's had estimates on construction knows that the construction costs are going to differ from your conceptual estimates. By the time you get into final design, we do get down there and do some archaeological work, and we've got to avoid a certain area, or there's utilities that weren't previously mapped. So there's always something that comes up. The stability problems in Cox Creek and Bottom Creek, I'd say they've reached the tipping point, but I strongly feel like they've already passed the tipping point as far as trying to get these things stabilized in a short term. It's going to be a long-term and costly process to mitigate the impacts of urbanization in both these watersheds. The master planning process is essential. And when I say master planning, it's not, what I have in mind is not, okay, let's look at everything citywide. No, let's look at the systems where you have problems and make sure that we're addressing those problems in their entirety, because there may be impacts elsewhere that haven't manifested themselves as problems, and the master planning process can get you there. LiDAR, current LiDAR data is invaluable from the planning process. Having a detailed LiDAR survey data that's accurate within better than a foot is priceless. With that, Mr. Wagner, do you have anything else you want to add? Certainly be willing to entertain any additional questions.
Yeah, I think your last point is important because that question came up earlier. I think if I understood the question right, was can the USGS study and some of the final design work occur concurrently in the next year or two? And you know, Joe's point that LiDAR data is really really helps in the design process. That's worth pointing that out regarding that question. So if there is any way that that the city is able to acquire LiDAR, at least in the areas that any final design would be occurring, that would be really valuable to help accelerate that process.
All right. Carol, I see you got your hand up.
This maybe is a question for Mr. Vunich. I'm just wondering whether the work that is in progress is included in the 13,000 that was indicated has already been committed, or whether we need to reserve some funds to complete this work.
We have reserved funds to complete the work. Some of the information that's been presented tonight by Mr. Wagner and Mr. Wilson has been invoiced and is to be paid, but we still have available funds committed to complete this portion of the study. And then, as we'll talk later tonight on our agenda, some of the additional items that are being considered. Thank you.
Right. Dr. Ham, if you don't mind, just one moment. Mr. Sturman, I think you had your hand up first there.
Last time we spoke about Mr. Wilson or Mr. Wagner, your estimate, when you put together a full estimate with all overhead and profits and everything, that you're adding on top of that a 30% contingency. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
And you're right, especially this kind of work, which is a moving target.
Yes, sir.
Doing conceptual estimating is pretty treacherous. I've done quite a bit for buildings, but I can't imagine this. But is that correct? You're tacking on 30% above what would be a total cost? Am I correct about that?
Yeah, we decided that 30% at this early stage would be prudent, just to be sure that we don't want you to get sticker shock later in the process. So if you're going to get it, let's get it now. And then hopefully as it progresses, hopefully we'll have some good news for you, but we'll just have to wait and see how that goes. If we're involved in that part of the process.
Yeah, it's to avoid bad news on bid day when receiving bids.
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly.
Dr. Hammer.
Thank you. Back to the LiDAR issue. My understanding is NRCS is flying LiDAR data for pretty much all of St. Louis County coming up pretty quickly. So there should be data that's outside the stream that'll be usable as well. One of the key issues here, I think, is can we get a second flying of LiDAR within 4 or 5 years so that we can get a handle on what's happening with some of these humongous and tightly packed point bars and gravel bars in the stream, because they are definitely affecting how the bank is eroding as they appear to be accumulating in volume and size, and we can't really quantify that without an awful lot of field work. But with LiDAR, we can do cut and fill analyses pretty quickly. So that's another issue that will be discussed later, I think. And I had some comments for that for the USGS folks with their proposal too. Thank you.
Right. Anybody else have any questions or concerns? Okay. Well, Mr. Vunich, I guess my question for you would be, is there something that you need from us this evening, or do we just continue this process as is with continuing to gain some data here for the next meeting?
As mentioned by Mr. Wilson, they will have the final report prepared for our next meeting in July. So at that time, the department will request some action.
Perfect. All right. I guess unless you guys really want to stick around, I think Mr. Wagner, Mr. Wilson, if you have other things to do this evening, you are welcome to depart. Unless you wanted to just hear us talk about all of the exciting things we have coming up.
Thank you very much. We appreciate the opportunity to work with y'all. It's a very challenging task that you have before you. Absolutely.
That is for sure.
Thanks for what you're doing.
All right. So let's see. I think we've got the USGS. We did that. We got the Wilson stuff. All right. So I believe we should be on our priorities here at this point. Mr. Vunich, is that something you wanted to discuss, or how would you like us to proceed with that?
Mr. Chair, I believe we skipped over the funding component.
Oh.
I believe Ms. Bolthouse was going to address
Well,
that.
let's talk about some funding. Everybody loves that kind of stuff. Carol, if you would.
Well, I think that we've, not gotten to the bottom of the list and already have a list of projects that far exceeds the funds that have currently been allocated. So, I think the assumption folks started with at the beginning of this, that we were going to, run into the need to address how we're going to pay for what needs to be done as a critical issue. I don't know how many of you had a chance to dig into Mr. Vunich's memo on options. One was what we could do with just, current funds. Second was, the funding, but also the timeline that would be associated with a parks and stormwater tax, and some options about how you could split that. And then a third was going towards some sort of a process where you would, issue bonds with the thought that you could pay for them over time. So, my perspective is I don't like paying interest on things, but I think we're chasing something that's going to keep getting more expensive just because the erosion is going to continue and accelerate the longer we wait. So the idea of figuring out what kind of, funds we could generate, sooner rather than later from both the existing taxes, the tax we have now would be, I guess, a question I think is worth answering as we proceed down whatever other path we would go. So discussion on that point of, and I guess maybe that's kind of a question for the experts of, is my thought that it is worth paying a little bit of a premium in terms of, interest on the money to get this done sooner rather than later. So.
Question on regarding bonds. I'm not an expert on bonds, but what do we think the interest rate on a bond might possibly be to cover some of the costs for this project at this point in time? I know it's a little bit difficult to predict in the future, but right now, where would it be at?
Well, prior to tonight's meeting, I asked Mr. Cross to do a little research, and he was kind enough to do it. So I'm going to hand the ball off to him.
Oh, gee, thanks, Mr. Vunich. With the co-chair's permission, I'll give you a quick primer on some of the options that we have to fund, a $5.3 million project ahead of us, and probably considerably higher as we go down the road. But I know Ms. Holthouse had asked specifically about bonds and interest rates and so forth. The options that we have, there is one type of bond. It's called a general obligation bond. Those rates are something a little less than, say, 2.5% interest rate on those kinds of bonds. I'm waiting for an answer from bond counsel to tell me if a GO, a general obligation bond, can be used for erosion control. need to get a legal interpretation. GO bonds can be used for certain things. It's not clear yet, whether it can for this. That would be something, of course, that would need to go before the voters. There are specific times of the year that you can place this on a ballot, and it requires a supermajority of the voters to pass a bond issue like this.
Mr. Cross, what is a supermajority? How is that defined?
That is 2/3 of the voters.
Okay, thank you.
There's another type of bond called a special obligation bond. This does not require a voter approval. However, it is secured by annual appropriation of funds, whatever that may be. So for instance, right now, the city generates $2.2 million from a capital improvement sales tax, as you see from the table that Mr. Vunich put together previously. If we wanted to allocate or use a portion of those, that would back a special obligation bond. The quantity, the amount of that bond is going to depend on your ability to repay them, and depending on the amount of bonds, the interest rates are a little bit higher. As you pay a little bit of a premium for a special obligation bond because it is subject to annual appropriation. That is probably somewhere in the 3.5% to 4% range. Probably it's under 4, but that one requires a little more analysis to nail it down. But suffice it to say, at this stage of our discussion, it's going to be higher than a general obligation bond. There's several other types of financing vehicles that are available to the city. There's an economic development sales tax that ultimately could be put before the voters, perhaps. That is, that sales tax would be 0.25% on sales. So it would generate a little bit of money. There is, as we have discussed previously, a parks and stormwater tax. That is a 0.5% sales tax. That is the definition, or that is the term that needs to be used when it goes on the ballot. As you all probably know, this was put before council back in April or May. It was postponed for 90 days. So it comes back to council in July, the latter part of July, to be addressed. If this were to, if the attempt was to put it on the November 2021 ballot, the ballot language itself would need to be, and everything, all the associated information that needs to go to the Board of Election Commissioners would need to be done by the end of August. So we are quickly approaching that deadline. So for all practical purposes, I don't believe that putting something like a parks and stormwater tax on the November 2021 ballot is a viable option. It's an option for later, but just not November. Other financing vehicles, a property tax. The city of Wildwood does not levy a property tax, but that doesn't mean that sometime in the future we couldn't choose to do so. In terms of terms, the length of time for the payment of the debt service on the bonds, general obligation bonds are typically 20 years. Special obligation bonds can be longer than that. They can be 25, they can even be 30-year bonds. Something else to consider is just because you put an amount, let's say that we decided, and I'm just going to pull a number out of the air. This is not, something that Wildwood would do, but let's say you wanted to issue a $50 million, a bond issue. Because the question was asked, does it make sense to go and do 2 smaller bond issues? The answer to that is no. You don't want to go back to the well twice. You want to do it one time. So let's say you only need 30 million. Or you need 50 million, but you don't need it all now. Well, you do a $50 million bond offering. If it passes, you could appropriate 30 million of it now and $20 million somewhere down the road, as long as that 50, you don't have to spend it all up the $50 million. There's another financing vehicle called a neighborhood improvement district. We have a NID, the city does have a NID, and this has to do with the sewer extension out Manchester Road. This one, it would be a little more problematic simply because define the neighborhood improvement district, given the fact that we're talking Cox Creek and Bonham Creek and the number of homeowners, because they would be the ones that would be paying assessments to pay off the bond, the debt service. It's a little tougher to get buy-in from a number of homeowners that size. Not impossible, but that might be a little further, that might be a little less of an option, but it nonetheless is an option. So that's just a real quick hit in terms of what the city can do in the future in terms of a new sales tax measure, a property tax measure, issuing bonds, and this doesn't discount the discussions that are taking place in Washington, D.C. right now with regards to infrastructure dollars. President Biden and his team is working on, $1.9 trillion infrastructure. The Republicans are looking at something significantly less than that, but those dollars, should this pass or some form of that infrastructure bill pass, could be used for these types of things, for watershed, for erosion control and so forth. Probably looking at, a ways down the road, maybe as much as a year, depending on how Congress deals with this issue. But that's being talked about right now. And that would provide a significant source of revenue that these types of expenditures would qualify for, at least under some of the initial guidelines as it relates to that infrastructure bill. So that's something that it's not a near-term possibility, but certainly is a longer-term possibility. As I say, perhaps even within 12 months, depending on what Congress does. So, Mr. Vunich and the co-chairs, thank you for the opportunity just to give you just a real quick summary of what our potential funding sources might be. Stay tuned because it's shifting daily, it seems. So, thank you.
All right. Sorry, guys, my internet cut out. And like a lot of places in Wildwood, while my internet is good most of the time, when it isn't, I don't get a phone that works here or a cell phone either. So I was flying blind there for a little bit. Lauren, I see you got your hand up. What's up?
Yes, you were just asking for some feedback and kind of thinking out loud. And as somebody sitting on council that sees multiple budget items come in and thinking over the last couple of years, even what the budget situation looked like pre-COVID, I certainly don't have a problem with bonding. I think it can be a great way to finance something. But the rhetorical question I've been asking myself throughout this meeting is, how much of this is an acknowledgement for long-term maintenance as well? So not just initial projects, but sort of, we'll call them tune-ups, maybe every couple of years, or fees for continually monitoring. And what I've seen since I've been on council has been budget cuts in Parks and Recreation for things even like mowing. And I'm hoping that can even out some, right? If we get some Wayfair sales tax money, and maybe that will kind of help boost what I have to work with, right? But if we keep growing as a city, we're adopting new roads, new streets, and if I even collect flat revenue, that's not a sustainable model. So I'm concerned if we go with bonding, what the messaging is, if you do this once, we're all done, when I don't necessarily have a sustainable revenue source for parks in the future. And we're growing, right? We're building new trails. We're hoping to build new parks, right? So I'm trying to wrap my head around, if we start with a bond to get money quicker, which I really liked Carol's point on that, how do I then turn around and make the argument to the voters, hey, I know you just did this, but we need to also think about a permanent tax in place as well, because I just feel like I can see it coming, and maybe another council member has a different perspective, but at least since I've been on council, I have seen departments being asked to do more and more with less and less and less. And it's not because of overspending, it's not because of wasteful spending, it's either decreasing or flat revenue streams, and we're a growing city.
Yeah, I don't necessarily disagree, Lauren. What I would say is I think it's a two-pronged approach right out of the gate. I mean, Larry, go ahead.
I know I'm new to this, but I'll throw in my 2 cents. I think on one side, I think the big thing we need to talk about as a city is, do we need more parks? Do we need to look at how we spend our money? And when I look at erosion and I look at these pictures and I just imagine, what if that was my house? What's more important, a new park or addressing erosion? So, and I think as a council, we definitely said erosion. My concern is I'm not an engineer. So I'm not a real technical person. I'm a CPA. I'm a money person, but I did own a construction company. My concern with starting out with something really big is, and I just challenge this back to all the technical people. Do we really know it's going to work? And in that regard, do we, the old thing, let's walk a little bit before we run, and really, pick an area. This is going to be long-term any way we look at it. I think it's going to be a forever thing. But I would like to see, what the city could do in the next couple of years to really test all these, I don't want to say theories, but call them engineering designs, and see that we really are making an improvement on some of the serious areas in the city. And then, and I just think we have to continue to set our priorities and operate the city where we see it's going. I think this is a very critical area for the city. But I'm also concerned that I would not necessarily want to go out and do anything really large out of the gate, because my concern is that, if there was 10 different people doing designs on these, would all 10 of them be identical? And I think the answer is no. So, it's like, I'm not a doctor, I'm not a lawyer, and I'm not going to practice that, but I'm not an engineer either. So, but I think we need to make progress every year, but I don't think we want to go too fast until we've proven that the path we're on is solid. That's sort of my 2 cents. On one side, I'm behind everything that was talked about, but I like to move cautiously. So, all right. Thank you.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, Larry. I was thinking this today, driving in to have this meeting. I have a 12-year-old that just lost her last tooth. So now we get to go talk about having braces put on her. And I realized we're going to, thankfully she also goes to the dentist, but my mind went to this idea of, we put all of these fancy parks and trails and all of this stuff in, which everybody loves. But if the underground part of this is falling apart, which it is, none of that's going to make any difference after a certain point. So, in looking at this presentation, to me, I think it probably goes without saying that the triple meander is the most visible and the biggest and probably the scariest thing that's going on. But it also makes up more than 50% of the entire project that we would be talking about. And, certainly, hopefully this won't be the case, but a house falling into the creek is going to make some news and going to get some attention. That's not the kind of attention I certainly would like to be responsible for. So I think we need to get creative with some of these things. And I think it's just a multiple touch point. People are going to have to understand this is not the kind of a thing that you fix one time and it's gone. This is a thing that will move up and down the waterways. It'll be an ongoing issue. It's something that has, off the top, Mr. Vunich or Steve, if you guys had to guess off the top of your head, in the last 25 years since the city's been around, how much genuine money has been invested in waterway repair and maintenance? I can think of this spot on Strecker Road. I don't know that there's been very much else than that, right?
Mr. Chair, I would probably ask Mr. Brown if he has
I mean, Rick, if you got a guess, it's not, I mean, I'm not gonna like hold your feet to the fire or anything. I think the point's gonna be that we haven't invested much, if any, on fixing this problem, and it's a pretty big one. But if Rick, if you got a guess, I think you're muted. If you got a guess, I'd love to hear it.
I was going to say we haven't invested much. I know I was going to reference we have done at least two that I can recall, two channel repairs, one there at the Triple Meander and then one further south of McBride Point of the bridge over Cox Creek. And those, I don't recall the dollar amount. Maybe Joe does. I'm guessing they were probably in the $1 million to $2 million range for both of them. And there may have been some other smaller repairs here and there, but that's probably been the lion's share of it, to my knowledge.
Yeah, I mean, it probably makes me a really bad politician, but I think we got to pay for the maintenance of the things we have before we put too many more fancy bushes and things places. There's not a whole lot of point to it. All right. So we did our funding. I believe if I missed over some of this, I apologize. I think we should be on. Let me pull it back up.
I think we have a couple hands up.
Oh, sure. Sorry. Who's got their?
Larry, did you have a question? Did you want to go first?
I was just going to point out Scott had his hand up.
Oh, thank you.
Oh, yeah, Scott, please go ahead. Sorry.
No, thank you. Mr. Pross, you mentioned a general obligation bond, and there were certain times of the year when we could put something like that before the voters. When would be the first time that we could put a general obligation bond before the voters, do you think? Do you know?
Realistically, it would be in 2022.
Okay.
I think we're too far along in 2021 to be able to pull the information together, particularly the information that Ms. Holthouse has been so diligently working on and has done such a great job in developing educational materials. I mean, we've got a really, really nice product, but at the end of the day, if we want to pass something like this, anything like a parks or stormwater tax, which, we've tried before, or going before voters for a bond, education, is a key component, which is why this task force formed a subcommittee that was headed up by Ms. Holthouse to get that done. And it's been discussed with the task force. The reality is, that there's quite a few people in the city of Wildwood that aren't affected by this. And, this is going to be a tough sell because it's going to require all the voters to go there. And some people may not believe that they don't live near Cox Creek or Bonham Creek and say, well, it doesn't affect me. Why should I, pay for something that doesn't affect me? So the education component is so critical. And so that's why I say 2021 is not the year to try to do this.
The reason I asked is in my own unscientific survey of the people I've talked to in Ward 3 so far, everybody seems to recognize that there is definitely a problem that needs to be addressed. And when it comes to preference over a financing vehicle, a bond, everybody seems to feel comfortable with, but I seem to get a little resistance when I float the idea of a permanent tax increase. So I was just curious as to the timing on both. To your point, obviously, whatever way we decide to go, we've got an educational campaign ahead of us.
Rob, did I see your hand up or no?
No, you did not. But I just want to comment that we built our way into this, and building our way out is going to take a bunch of money. But I think it's key to make sure that we make that point to everyone. It's partly climate change, but it's partly mistakes that we made in the past, and we can help ourselves out a whole lot if we don't continue to make those same mistakes.
Yep. All right. So I think next up would then be let's see, we're through the priorities. Where did we leave off? The property owner creek repair improvements permitting stuff. Is that where we're at? I think it is.
And again, Mr. Chair, with your permission, I'd like to ask Madam Chair to kind of introduce this issue as well.
Sure.
I didn't hear that last part, so if
Oh, you were gonna, Joe's asking if you wouldn't mind introducing the permitting piece component.
okay, and when there was a pause, I wondered if that might be what was going on. So apologies for missing that. Yeah, I suggested after getting the initial preliminary report from Wilson that we ask them to provide a proposal that would tell us what their fees would be in the short term to take the engineering to a level where we could get permits. At best, that's a 6-month project process. And once we get those permits, they're good for 5 years. So I don't see any downside in terms of starting to get some more, figure out whether that 30% contingency is generous or just enough or, a little short. Get, whatever feedback we're going to get from the Corps of Engineers about the permitting process itself, and go ahead, and get that started. The other issue that we've kind of set aside is whether there's any work that we could do in terms of, moving bed load and, taking some of these point bars that are being deposited and, just putting them someplace else in a way that would buy us a little time. So maybe asking them to make some sort of recommendations on that as well. So.
Mr. Sturman, you got your hand up there?
Yeah. Regarding the permits, are you speaking of the construction permit for when we have a project ready to go, we've taken bids and the design and taken bids and it's ready to go, the permit to commence construction, you feel is going to be about 6 months? Carol,
The information Wilson gave, I don't know that that's all the permits you need, but that was the process with the Corps of Engineers.
Who all do we have to go to for permitting? Who are all the entities that we have to obtain a permit from?
I believe it varies a little bit from location to location, depending on whether, if there's a bridge impact, then MoDOT has a dog in that fight. If sewers are involved, then MSD. So, even answering that question is, again, something it's probably time to get going on and understanding what it would take. If the pipeline of money opened up immediately, what we would have to do before we could start spending it on construction.
If it's Corps of Engineers, then probably it'll certainly be 6 months. If it's MSD, they take plenty long, but yeah, I think that would be something to find out.
Yeah, I mean, I think it goes pretty much without saying all of the locations would deal with the Corps of Engineers. So, I mean, at a minimum, we're dealing on their timeline for sure. And, as a person who sort of works in government, I can tell you none of us move very fast. So it's going to be a minute.
A couple of projects, creek projects I did at my home required DNR approval. That was kind of the big bottleneck for me. It wasn't the Corps. They may be involved in the larger projects, but probably going to be a hodgepodge.
All right. So while I was offline, did you guys talk, Carol, did you guys talk at all about the supporting property owners, creek repairs and improvements?
No, we have not talked about that yet.
I think that's probably up next, is it not?
Mr. Chair?
Yes, sir.
I think Mr. Brown had a comment about agency review.
Yeah, please.
Yeah, thank you, Joe. It really wasn't that important. I was just going to reference as far as the permitting. Typically, the 404 permit goes hand in hand with a 401 permit from the state DNR. So it's usually hand in glove. You have to go from one to the other. So those permits would have to be obtained. MSD was referenced. MSD and Cox Creek would be integral into approving what we are proposing on the project. In my expectation, MSD is going to want to see detailed plans and a flood study, which is something the city would require as well. And we would also have to issue a floodplain development permit for pretty much all the projects to comply with the National Flood Insurance Program. So that's kind of aligned, and then in a nutshell, the permitting process, I guess, that typically comes into play.
So, I certainly don't want to send Wilson off on a, wild goose chase if we don't think if that number is something we can afford, that would be a make sense next step. So I'll defer to my Joes here in terms of whether this is something that requires a motion or whether, just our intent is enough. Again, we're not, by asking them, we're not making any commitments, whether we should wait till we receive that proposal or whether we should make some formal recognition of our intent.
Yeah, Rick, does it make, is there such a thing as like a sort of moving permit where step one would be we can, get a skid load or something down there and just move some stuff around to help as we figure the rest of this stuff out? Or is that going to be project one and then we have to do it all over again? Would you guess?
Well, I think anytime you're working in the channel, it triggers the need to coordinate with the Corps, and it also triggers potentially MSD and city involvement from the floodplain development permitting standpoint. Because if we do any disturbance in the floodplain, they're looking for a permit to be on file. So we do try to take it pretty seriously, whether that's a fairly, what might be perceived as a fairly minimal disturbance like a bobcat or something in the channel. We have made that a requirement, and we're supposed to, that a floodplain development permit is issued for that type of work, and that may actually require a hydraulic analysis be done. So those are discussions that really would have to be brought up with those entities in terms of what they're, whether it's the Corps of Engineers or MSD, what they would require. So I don't know that we have an answer for you right now.
So I just saw this because it happened literally behind my house. There was a exposure of, I guess it was a main water line or something about 2 years ago. And within 10 minutes, there was 17 trucks here and they repaved everything down in the creek and buried all this stuff. I think it would be next to impossible that any of them got any permits to do that. So how does if there's an emergency situation, which perhaps this could be considered, how does that affect this, if at all?
Well, I think there's exceptions for emergency repairs that can be made. I don't know the work we're proposing would fall into that category, but certainly if it was identified there was a sanitary sewer main that was broken and was a hazard, needed to be repaired immediately, those kind of things would certainly I think be allowable, and then they could follow up subsequent to that work to get the permits obtained.
Okay, well, we'll cross the permit bridge, I guess, when we come to it. I mean, if it's not, is there, I assume those reports and things are pretty expensive, correct?
Honestly, I wouldn't say that the Corps of Engineers and DNR permitting process is all that expensive. It does take some time to work through, but I've never felt it was extraordinarily expensive. It's just coordination. It does take some effort. The floodplain development permitting process is a little more onerous. It does require a hydraulic study to be done. That pulls in a hydraulics engineer running computer models of the creek channel, showing existing conditions, showing the proposed condition, to demonstrate that the water surface elevation doesn't increase, that we're not increasing anyone's risk for flooding. So that's the one that really does take the most effort, in my opinion, and to get through, and that's the one that we need to probably be cognizant of the most, in my opinion.
And that's a city requirement, though, right?
Well, it's a city requirement, but it effectively stems from federal requirements associated with the National Flood Insurance Program. We are simply required to enforce those regulations, but they're federal regulations that it stems from. Yeah.
Mr. Vunich, I see you got your hand up.
I will wait till Mr. Sturman's question's been answered.
All right, Mr. Sturman.
Okay, thank you. Do we have contacts you've been working with in the past, Rick, with the ones that could be problematic in times, such as the Corps of Engineers and MSD, do we have contacts there, people that we know to go to and ask the question, I guess, if we, let's say if it's Triple Meander is the first project, and that we come up with construction documents that have all of the data that they expect, begin to just ask what kind of timing, which maybe timing changes as time goes by too. I don't know. I just wonder if we're in contact with such representatives.
Well, certainly we are the consultants we work with frequently make those contacts. It's a routine part of many of the projects that we do. I'm sure Mr. Wilson would have no problem following up with the Corps of Engineers and starting that process. I'm sure he's done it many times on other projects as well. MSD, we've got a direct contact on the committee, frankly, with MSD. There's other folks there that we've worked with over the years that we know to follow up with. So I don't see that as being a concern. It's just a hurdle that you have to cross. It does take a little bit of time to get over it.
All right, Mr. Vunich.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair and members of the task force, prior to tonight's meeting, the Department of Planning did have a conversation with Mr. Wilson, Mr. Wagner, and Ms. Holthouse attended, as well as Mr. Newberry. In anticipation of this discussion, I did ask for a proposal from Wilson Hydro to begin the permitting process. And that permitting process would be with the Corps of Engineers and the Metropolitan St. Louis Sewer District. So there is a memorandum in the packet, and for the most part says that to refine the conceptual drawings to the point that they could be submitted to those two agencies, and to begin that permitting process for 3 projects: the Triple Meander, the Elegant Child Detention Basin, and Evergreen Forest Court. It would be just under $18,000. Thank you.
So, I mean, based on that, Joe, is that something that you feel like we maybe at least need to consider moving forward on just that part to get the ball rolling?
I think that was the impression I left the meeting, is that if the Corps takes 6 to 12 months, if we don't start sometime, we're always going to be 6 to 12 months out. But the cost is something that I need. I just received this on June 18th. You all just received it at the beginning of this week. So I would like you all to review the proposal that's part of the packet so that maybe we could discuss it in better detail in July.
Okay. We could do that. All right, what about improving detention basin effectiveness? I know we got about, I don't know, 9 minutes or so left. Do we want to? Yes, sir.
I'm not sure that, in 10 minutes of speed.
Probably not a good
task listing, we're going to get too far. What I would maybe suggest as a process is, people, we've got, I liked how Joe was talking about 3-legged stools. I think we've got, unfortunately, something that feels more like I don't know how many headed monster we're trying to tame. So what I would suggest is that people think through, between mitigating critical locations, trying to figure out how we support property owners, trying to do repairs and improvements on their own property, improving detention basin effectiveness, sort of this idea of we need a master plan and public education, that people kind of start with just sort of a high level, we're going to run out of budget, we're going to run out of city staff time before we run out of things to do. So maybe thinking through at a high level where they think the priorities are, which head we need to do battle with first. And then, taking those setting some priorities first, and then maybe digging down into the tasks and those higher priority areas first. So.
Okay.
So maybe we can, I've started a sort of a long task list sort of thing that fed into some of this. So maybe just, I don't know if we've got a way of publishing that someplace where people can work on it collaboratively on the SharePoint site, and kind of get people's thoughts there. And then the other reality is, committees like this can work as sort of a steering committee, directing, city staff and spending, city money on consultants. Or you could be a Richard Sturman who says, let me roll up my sleeves and become a committee of one and do a lot of work on my own time. So I think the other thing that's relevant is just where people have expertise and a passion and time and are willing to, take on some tasks and do some, accept some responsibility and do some assignments as well. So that the process maybe for that would be putting out a schedule of time where people could talk with Joe and I and sort of say, hey, here's what I'm thinking and here's where I think I could contribute, and put that into some sort of master plan that would get us to the next year or two.
Yep, I think
Does that plan make any objections to moving forward with that as kind of a working plan on how we advance these agenda items without taking our meeting past 8 o'clock?
Lauren, you got something to add?
Yeah, just real quick, I know that Carol and I had great ambitions for a booth at the Lawn and Garden Summit before it was canceled, and it will hopefully, the plan is to reschedule it in the spring, but in the meantime, I don't think we want to lose the opportunity to have a booth at Celebrate Wildwood, and you might want to consider as chairs putting that on the agenda or just working on it behind the scenes so that we don't lose time before September. And not sure, where you'll end up getting a stream table from, or if you want a banner printed like HPC does in their booths of like the Watershed system or anything like that. But I just think it would be a good thing to do. And if you guys agree, then we probably should start pursuing that. If I remember right, I think Celebrate Wildwood happens before the September Watershed meeting, but don't quote me on that.
That sounds suspiciously like you're volunteering to do that, Lauren.
I'm not on the education committee anymore.
Well, and actually in the short time we have left, we started out, I think, with 5 subcommittees. We're down to 2, only one of which has a chair, and that chair is myself on the Public Education Committee. All of the subcommittee meetings, I think, put a burden on not only the people on the committee, but on city staff who have to publish agendas and minutes and, find the Zoom time and whatever. So I would propose that we disband those subcommittees and focus more on, individual task assignments and take out sort of that middle management layer. So I guess as a chair, I can't make a motion to that effect, but if it sounds like I'm thinking straight and somebody wants to suggest that structural changes of disbanding those 2 subcommittees.
Actually, as a point of information, didn't we do that at the last meeting? Or I thought we disbanded all of the subcommittees. Did we not? No, we did everything but those 2.
I don't remember us doing that.
Yeah.
But if you want to make the motion for us to disband them, Lauren, that would be fantastic. Or not. Lauren loves subcommittees.
I'll make that motion.
Perfect. Thank you, Scott. How about a second? Who would like to second that? There we go. Mr. Sturman. Okay. Mr. Vunich, before we vote, did you have something you wanted to add to that or no?
Not regarding this motion, but before we close, I do have one more update. Thank you.
All right. So let's deal with the motion here really quickly. All those in favor of disbanding the subcommittees, please say aye.
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 Aye. Anyone opposed? No. Any abstentions? Excellent. Subcommittees are no more. Fantastic. Mr. Vunich, let's close it out, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Many of the task force members may recall from our last meeting, Dr. Rambo had initiated a discussion with Dr. Hammer about the follow-up with our residents that submitted problem areas on their property, and that follow-up had not occurred. And so we've kind of left a lot of people kind of hanging without a conclusion to their request. the task force agreed to proceed forward with it. That particular item was presented to City Council and they concurred. And so, not this past week, but I believe the week prior, Dr. Hammer, Dan Ron, our assistant city engineer, Travis Newberry and I met. And so Dr. Hammer and Dan Ron are going to do that work for us, as well as test the critical matrix that's been developed by Ms. Clark, Ms. Holthouse, and Dr. Hammer. So that is going to be underway right after the holiday. So I just wanted to update you. Thank you.
Excellent. Mr. Rambo.
Yeah, Joe, that also includes the detention basins that were identified by the Boy Scouts and others as well, doesn't it?
It does. My apology. Yeah, it's inclusive of that particular item as well. Thank you.
Awesome. All right. Well, I know we still have a few things on the agenda that I don't think anyone, unless anyone is opposed, I'm sure that we can carry them over to our next meeting. So with that, I guess I would be looking for a motion to adjourn this evening. Miss Edens?
Second.
Excellent. I believe that's a non-debatable thing, right? So all those in favor of adjournment, let's get out of here.
Aye.
Out
Excellent.
here.
Aye.
All right. Thank you, everybody. We will see you next month.
Good job, y'all. Bye.
Yeah, great job.